Can you imagine a winter so long that the sun sinks before supper and does not meaningfully return until well after you have risen again? The light is brief, the air carries a metallic edge, and every surface outside your door seems carved from frost. In such a season, warmth is not decorative and it is not optional. It is survival itself. And in a small medieval village, where timber walls strain against wind and snow settles thick upon thatch, there is only one place where dependable heat is guaranteed to endure through the night, the great communal oven at the heart of the settlement. In that stone chamber rests a low, steady glow, a bed of embers carefully banked beneath ash. Those coals are more than fuel, they are continuity. If they die, the oven must be rebuilt from cold stone, and that labor could cost an entire day's bread. In winter, a lost day of bread is no small inconvenience. It is hunger. It is uncertainty. It is the subtle shift between security and worry. And so, while most of the village sleeps, one figure remains awake to watch that quiet, breathing fire. Tonight, we step softly into that bakery. We close the heavy wooden door behind us and allow the wind to fade. We stand beside the wide mouth of the oven and feel the dry, radiant heat press against chilled skin. In the hush between midnight and dawn, we rediscover the discipline of the fire watcher and the scent of rye and oak that carried warmth through the darkest nights of the medieval winter. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. Introduction: The Keeper of the Only Flame. It is well past midnight when the baker crosses the narrow lane toward his workshop. Snow has crusted along the edges of the path, and the air is so cold it seems to tighten the lungs with each breath. The village is still. Doors are barred. Shutters are closed. Inside the cottages, families lie wrapped in wool blankets, sharing warmth beneath low ceilings blackened by smoke. The silence is not peaceful in the modern sense. It is protective, as though every household has withdrawn inward to preserve its strength against the long, cold hours. The bakery door opens with a low wooden groan, and as the baker steps inside, the world changes. The darkness remains, but it is different here. The air is warmer, thicker, touched by the scent of oak and old flour and stone that has absorbed decades of heat. At the center of the room stands the great oven, its curved masonry walls holding the memory of countless fires. Within it, beneath a careful covering of pale ash, rests a deep orange glow. The embers are not lively flames. They are restrained, patient, almost dignified in their endurance. In a 14th century winter, the baker's role extended far beyond shaping dough. He was entrusted with maintaining the village's most reliable source of sustained heat. If the fire failed during the night, the oven would cool, and hours would be lost rebuilding the necessary temperature. The morning bake, upon which every household depended, would falter. Bread was not a luxury. It was the foundation of daily sustenance, providing the bulk of calories for rich and poor alike. To allow the hearth to die was to allow uncertainty to spread through the entire community. And so the baker keeps vigil. While the village sleeps, he studies the embers with a practiced gaze. His work at this hour is quiet, almost invisible, yet it carries immense consequence. He kneels before the oven mouth and feels the steady wave of heat against his face and forearms. He listens to the faint crackle within the coals, learning from their sound whether they burn too fiercely or too faintly. In this dim chamber, the fire is no spectacle. It is responsibility, contained and deliberate. Prologue. Before the first ember. Long before the baker opens the heavy wooden door, long before embers are stirred and flour touches water, there is winter. Winter that does not apologize. Winter that does not hurry. The kind of winter that settles over fields and forests and lingers without promise of early thaw. Snow lies heavy along rooftops and presses against timbered walls. The earth hardens beneath frost. Streams grow silent beneath thin ice. And daylight, when it comes, feels brief and distant, as though the sun itself has withdrawn to preserve its strength. In such a season, warmth becomes more than comfort. It becomes the quiet line between endurance and decline. Fire is not decorative. It is not symbolic. It is necessary. Without it, bread cannot bake. Without bread, strength cannot be restored. And without strength, even the smallest tasks grow heavy. Across medieval Europe, villages learned to measure their winters not only in snowfall, but in how well they guarded their heat. Chimneys smoked cautiously, wood piles were rationed carefully, every ember mattered, and in the center of many towns stood the great communal oven, thick-walled, stone-bellied, built to gather and hold the labor of flame. Before we enter the bakery, before we kneel beside the fire, we pause here for a moment and consider the quiet truth of that world. Survival was rarely dramatic. It was steady. It depended on small acts repeated faithfully. It depended on someone rising when others slept. It depended on embers being preserved through darkness. And so, as the night deepens and frost settles over the silent village, we follow the one who keeps watch. We step toward the warmth that waits behind stone. We enter the bakery not as hurried observers, but as quiet witnesses to a vigil that has already begun. Tonight's story is called How Medieval Bakers Tended Hearth Fires Through Long Cold Nights. Chapter 1. The Frozen Toll of the Night Watch. The transition from the outer frost to the oven's dry heat is a sensation that settles deep into the body. Fingers that moments ago felt stiff and unresponsive begin to ache as warmth returns. The wool of the baker's cloak releases a faint scent of snow and smoke as it dries. The air inside the bakery does not embrace gently. It radiates with a focused intensity that pulls moisture from the skin and steadies the breath. This contrast between bitter cold and contained heat defines the rhythm of the night watch. The baker takes up his iron tool and gently draws the coals inward, concentrating their warmth toward the heart of the oven floor. Each motion must be measured. If too much air is allowed to rush in, the embers will flare brightly and consume themselves too quickly. If they are smothered beneath too thick a blanket of ash, they will fade into dull gray lifelessness. The art lies in balance, in allowing the fire to breathe just enough to remain alive without exhausting its strength before dawn. Outside, the wind moves along the narrow streets, slipping between timber frames and rattling loose shutters. Snow shifts in quiet drifts against doorways. The village remains unaware of the careful adjustments unfolding within the bakery walls. Yet the outcome of these small decisions will determine the quality of the morning bread. The baker understands this instinctively. The weight of that knowledge rests in his shoulders as tangibly as the iron rake in his hands. There is a toll to such vigilance. The hours between midnight and dawn stretch long, and fatigue presses steadily at the edges of awareness. The body longs for rest, for the warmth of shared blankets, for the simple relief of closing one's eyes. But the baker cannot surrender to sleep. He watches the subtle shifts in color within the embers, noting when orange deepens to red or when ash settles in thin collapses along the surface. These are the signs by which he measures time, long before the first faint paling of the eastern sky. And yet within that quiet labor, there is also a strange steadiness. The crackle of oak fibers releasing their last stored energy becomes a kind of companionship. The soft shimmer of heat across stone walls offers reassurance that the oven holds firm. In tending this fire, the baker participates in a chain of endurance stretching back through generations. Others have knelt here before him, guiding embers through winter nights, ensuring that warmth greets the village at dawn. When at last the sky begins its nearly imperceptible shift from iron gray toward pale blue, the embers still glow. They have endured the longest hours. Soon fresh wood will be added, flames will rise, and dough will be prepared. But for now, in this suspended moment between darkness and light, the fire lives, quiet, steady, sufficient. And because it lives, the village will eat. Chapter 2. The Science of Banking the Embers. In the medieval bakery, the fire is not treated like a casual thing that can be fed and forgotten. It is watched the way one watches a child in a harsh season or a lantern in a narrow corridor, because it is not only heat that must be preserved, but time itself. A great stone oven does not forgive impatience. If it cools, it does not simply return with a quick spark. It must be coaxed back slowly, patiently, sometimes for hours, until the stones are saturated with warmth again. The baker knows this, and that knowledge shapes every choice he makes in the deep hours of the night, when the village sleeps and the wind outside seems to search for every weakness in wood and straw. He leans close to the mouth of the oven, not rushing, not careless, and he studies the coals the way a sailor studies the sea. The embers hold their own language. Their color tells him what they are doing beneath the ash. A stronger glow means the heart is still lively. A dulling shade means the breath of the fire is thinning. He does not need a thermometer because his work has trained him to read the small signs that others would overlook. He watches how the ash settles, whether it rests lightly like powder or clumps in heavier patches, and he listens for the faintest crackle, that quiet sound that suggests the coals still have strength inside them. Then comes the careful work of banking, a practice that sounds simple until you understand what is at stake. The baker draws the embers inward, gathering them toward the center where their heat can support itself. He shapes them into a low mound, not too high, not too spread, because the geometry of the coal bed matters. Too much exposure and the embers consume themselves too quickly, burning hot and fast, leaving nothing for the hours ahead. Too much smothering and they suffocate beneath their own ash, slipping into a gray silence that cannot be revived without starting again. Banking is not the extinguishing of fire, it is the preservation of it, like placing a living thing under a warm blanket that is thin enough to breathe through. The wood itself is chosen with the same seriousness. A baker does not waste precious hours with green wood that spits and steams and refuses to burn cleanly. In winter, the fuel must be seasoned, dried long enough to behave predictably, because predictability is what allows the baker to plan the morning bake without clocks. Hardwood, especially oak in many regions, burns slow and steady and leaves a coal bed that can endure. It is not only flame he wants, it is the long afterlife of that flame, the part that remains when the blaze has quieted. He is thinking ahead to dawn, to the moment when dough must meet a properly heated hearth, and he is shaping that future now with every careful adjustment of ember and ash. And because there are no mechanical timers here, the baker measures heat with his body and with his senses, with a kind of practiced humility. He holds his hand near the oven mouth and counts silently, not with numbers that must be exact, but with an inner rhythm learned through repetition. He watches the way heat shimmers against stone, the way it distorts the air, and he knows whether the oven is holding steady or slowly losing its strength. In some places, a baker might toss a pinch of flour onto the oven floor and read its reaction, not as a trick, but as a quiet test passed down through years of apprenticeship. There is nothing theatrical about it. It is simply an old method of listening to stone and fire, of asking the oven gently what it is ready to do. The longer the night stretches, the more precious this skill becomes. Winter is not forgiving, and the baker cannot afford guesswork. He must preserve enough heat to carry the oven through the final hours, yet not burn so hot that the fire eats all its fuel before morning. He must keep the embers alive without waking the whole building into roaring flames that demand constant attention. He must balance endurance and restraint, which is why the science of banking is not a single act, but an ongoing relationship, repeated in small moments through the night. He returns again and again, not anxiously, but steadily, like someone checking a sleeping child's breath, like someone making sure the lantern still glows. By the time dawn begins to shift the sky, the embers are still there, glowing quietly beneath their pale covering. The oven stones hold warmth like memory, and in that moment, the baker has done something that few will notice and almost none will praise, because the village will only see the result. Bread that arrives on time, crust that cracks cleanly, steam that rises into cold air like a promise kept. But the baker knows the truth of it. The bread begins here hours before flour. Chapter 3: Rhythm and Ritual by Candlelight. With the embers secured and the oven stones holding their quiet reservoir of heat, the baker turns from fire to flour. The night is not yet finished. In many ways, it is only deepening. A single tallow candle burns along the thick wooden table, its flame small but persistent, casting slow-moving shadows against the stone walls. The light is not bright enough to banish darkness entirely, but it is sufficient. In medieval workshops, sufficiency is often enough. The air smells faintly of smoke and grain, and in that dim, enclosed space, the baker begins the next phase of his vigil. Before him rests a heavy wooden trough filled with coarse rye and barley flour, grains that endure cold climates more reliably than delicate wheat. Rye bread is dense, sustaining, darker in color and flavor, and in winter it provides the kind of nourishment that lingers in the body. The baker pours water slowly into the trough, water that may have been drawn from a well that threatens to freeze in harsh weather. He adds a portion of leaven preserved from a previous bake, the living culture that links today's bread to yesterday's. Nothing here begins from nothing. Everything is continuation. He plunges his hands into the mixture, and the dough resists him. Rye does not behave like the light, elastic doughs of later centuries. It is heavy, sticky, and stubborn, demanding strength rather than finesse. The baker pushes forward, folds the mass inward, turns it, presses again. The motion is deliberate and unhurried, because haste would exhaust him long before dawn. In the flickering candlelight, his shadow moves across the wall in slow repetition, arms extending and drawing back over and over, shaping sustenance from grain and water. The work is physically taxing, especially in the hours when the body would rather sleep. Shoulders ache, palms sting where skin has cracked from winter dryness. The rhythm of kneading becomes a kind of endurance exercise, not only for muscle but for mind. Yet it is precisely this repetition that prevents exhaustion from overwhelming him. When movement settles into pattern, thought quiets, breath aligns with motion, push, fold, turn, press. The body finds a cadence that can be sustained, and within that cadence there is something almost meditative, as though the baker is not merely preparing bread but participating in a ritual older than memory. In such hours, the imagination can wander. Medieval winters were long, and the darkness often felt inhabited by more than wind alone. Folklore threaded through daily life, not as fantasy, but as a way of naming uncertainty. Some believed that cold spirits lingered near thresholds and corners, that unseen forces might sour dough or sour luck if not properly acknowledged. Whether the baker truly believed such tales or simply respected them as tradition, he may have murmured a quiet prayer while working, or marked the surface of the dough with a simple sign before setting it aside to rest. These gestures were not dramatic. They were small acts of reassurance in a world where much remained unpredictable. The candle burns lower as the dough slowly comes together under his hands. What began as separate elements has transformed into a unified mass, pliable and ready for shaping. The baker divides it carefully, weighing portions by experience rather than scale, judging fairness by feel and sight. Each loaf represents not only food, but trust. When the village gathers at dawn, they will assume the bread is sufficient, evenly baked, worthy of their coin or their exchange. That assumption rests upon the quiet labor unfolding now, long before their footsteps approach the door. And so the kneading continues, steady and patient, until the trough is empty and the shaped loaves rest beneath linen cloths, sheltered from drafts. The fire remains alive behind him, the oven stones gathering strength for the moment when flame will rise again in preparation for baking. Between candlelight and ember glow, between cold night and approaching dawn, the baker stands in a narrow space where solitude and service meet. He works alone, yet everything he does is for others. By the time the first faint hint of morning touches the horizon, the dough is ready, the oven is warm, and the long night's vigil begins to tilt toward reward. The rhythm of his hands has carried him through the deepest hours, and in that rhythm lies the quiet resilience of a craft shaped by winter after winter, generation after generation. Chapter 4: The Social Weight of the Communal Crust. By the time the eastern sky begins its slow and almost imperceptible softening, the bakery no longer feels entirely separate from the world outside. The darkness is still present, but it has thinned. A subtle gray seeps into the narrow window slits, and the cold beyond the walls no longer feels absolute. Inside, the oven has been brought back to full strength. Fresh wood has been added. Flames have risen and then settled again, leaving the stones saturated with stored heat. The loaves, shaped hours earlier beneath candlelight, now rest in patient readiness. In many medieval towns and villages, the oven was not solely the baker's private tool, but a communal necessity. Some households prepared their own dough and brought it to be baked in the shared hearth, especially where individual ovens were rare or impractical. Others relied entirely on the baker's craft. In either case, the oven stood at the center of daily life. It was the place where grain became nourishment, where labor transformed into sustenance, and where the abstract idea of survival took physical form in crust and crumb. With this centrality came weight, not only physical weight in the form of dense rye loaves, but social and legal weight as well. Bread in the medieval world was regulated with seriousness. Authorities in many regions enforced standards regarding the size and price of loaves, recognizing that fairness in bread was fairness in survival. A loaf that was too small or improperly made was not simply disappointing. It could be a violation, even a threat to communal trust. The baker's reputation rested upon consistency. He was expected to produce loaves that met both expectation and regulation, and to do so reliably, even when winter strained every resource. As dawn advances, faint sounds begin to ripple through the village. A door opens somewhere down the lane. Boots step onto packed snow. A thin trail of chimney smoke lifts into the pale air. The world is waking, and with it comes quiet anticipation. Those who approach the bakery door do not see the hours of vigilance that preceded this moment. They do not see the careful banking of embers, the aching shoulders, the kneading by candlelight. What they see is warmth spilling outward as the door opens, and the first breath of bread-scented air meeting the frost. When the oven mouth is finally cleared and the loaves are placed upon the heated stone, there is a sense of culmination. The heat that was preserved through the long night now fulfills its purpose. Dough that was heavy and resistant transforms in that intense enveloping warmth. Steam forms within the crust, the surface darkens and tightens. Inside, structure sets. What began as grain harvested months ago now becomes something immediate and essential. Outside, more footsteps gather. Conversation remains low, partly from cold, partly from custom. The bakery door opens and closes, releasing waves of heat that feel almost miraculous against winter air. When the loaves are drawn out at last, their crusts firm and fragrant, they are not treated casually. They are received with hands that understand their value. In a season where little grows and daylight is scarce, bread represents steadiness. It is the assurance that yesterday's labor and last night's vigilance were not in vain. The baker stands amid this quiet exchange, no longer alone, but still carrying the residue of solitude. His night's work is largely invisible now, absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of morning. Coins change hands, portions are divided, families return to their homes with warmth cradled against their coats, and as the sun lifts slightly higher over the frost-silvered fields, the village resumes its daily motion, sustained by a fire that did not falter in the dark. In this way, private endurance becomes public nourishment. The embers tended in silence ripple outward into the life of the community. What was once a solitary vigil becomes shared security, and the simple act of keeping fire alive reveals itself as an act of stewardship, quiet, steady, and essential. Chapter 5: Legacy of the Hearth in the Modern Winter. As the morning settles fully over the village and the last of the loaves disappear into waiting hands, the bakery grows quieter once more. The great oven, having fulfilled its purpose, begins its gradual cooling. Ash rests where flame once moved. The stone walls release heat slowly, as though reluctant to surrender it all at once. And in that gentle easing from intensity to calm, there is space to reflect on what this nightly ritual truly represents. The medieval baker did not think of himself as participating in history. He did not imagine that centuries later people would speak of artisanal methods, wood-fired ovens, or slow fermentation as something precious or rediscovered. He was simply doing what winter required. He was preserving warmth so that grain could become bread, and bread could become strength. Yet within that simple necessity lies the foundation of practices that still endure: the careful tending of embers, the respect for seasoned hardwood, the understanding that time and heat must work together rather than against one another. These are not modern inventions. They are inheritances. In our own age, when warmth can be summoned with a switch and bread can be purchased without ever seeing the oven that shaped it, there remains a quiet longing for slowness. Many seek out loaves baked in stone hearths, crusts formed by real flame, dough allowed to ferment at its natural pace. There is comfort in knowing that some processes cannot be rushed, that certain transformations demand patience. When we choose such bread, we are not merely selecting flavor. We are reaching back, perhaps unknowingly, toward a rhythm that once governed survival itself. The medieval night watch was solitary, but it was not isolated in spirit. It was part of a cycle that connected soil, seed, harvest, fire, and table. It required endurance in darkness with trust in the coming light. That pattern has not vanished. It repeats in quieter forms, in bakers who rise before dawn, in hands that still knead dough by feel rather than by timer, in households that gather around a warm loaf while winter presses at the windows. And perhaps that is why the image remains so powerful. A warm loaf cradled in cold hands, steam rising into chilled air, crust breaking with a soft and certain sound. It is a small triumph over frost, a modest but meaningful proof that human beings have always found ways to cooperate with fire rather than fear it, to shape the elements into sustenance, to endure seasons that might otherwise overwhelm them. Long before electric light and insulated walls, someone knelt beside embers and refused to let them fade. Someone balanced ash and oxygen with care. Someone worked through fatigue so that others might wake to warmth. That quiet decision, repeated night after night, winter after winter, forms part of the unseen architecture of our present comforts. And so when we think of the medieval baker tending his hearth through the longest cold, We are not only observing a figure in the past, we are witnessing a pattern of resilience that continues in every act of patient creation, every choice to preserve steadiness when circumstances grow harsh. The fire, banked carefully beneath ash, becomes a symbol not only of heat but of endurance, a reminder that survival often depends less on brilliance and more on quiet constancy. As the last glow settles into memory and the bakery door closes against the morning chill, the image remains, stone warm beneath the hand, flour dust lingering in the air, and the promise of bread carried home beneath winter sky. The hearth has done its work, the village is fed, and somewhere within us, the ember of that long vigil still burns. Epilogue. After the last loaf. The morning has come and gone, the loaves have been carried home. The bakery, once alive with flame and motion, rests again in a softened stillness. The oven cools slowly, releasing its warmth in patient sighs. Ash settles where flame once danced. The tools are laid aside, the trough is scraped clean. Outside, the village resumes its ordinary rhythm. Footsteps, voices, smoke rising in thin spirals against pale winter sky. What remains is not spectacle, it is not triumph, it is something quieter. It is the knowledge that the fire endured, that through the longest hours of cold, someone remained awake. Someone preserved heat carefully enough that morning would not begin in hunger. The medieval baker's vigil may seem small against the vastness of history. No monument marks those nights. No chronicler recorded the exact hour an ember was stirred back to life. And yet, without such nights, there would have been no mornings of bread, no steady nourishment, no strength to continue through winter's demands. In every age there are quiet keepers of warmth. Some tend literal fires, others preserve traditions or safeguard knowledge, or offer steady presence in uncertain seasons. Their work is rarely dramatic. It is patient, it is persistent, it asks for endurance more than applause. And so, as we leave the stone bakery and step back into our own time, we carry with us the image of embers banked beneath ash, glowing, restrained, sufficient, a reminder that resilience does not always roar. Often it rests quietly in the dark, waiting for dawn. The hearth has done its work, and the village is fed, and somewhere within us the ember remains.